Hello, the 31st here, how's it going? Welcome back to another PowerPoint presentation. Today, we're going to be looking at Cubone. Now, Cubone is a Pokemon with many mysteries, but today we're going to be focusing on its skull. Specifically, what kind of skull is it, and how did it get there? This discussion is sort of prompted by a discussion we've been having in the Fuji's Lab Discord server run by Birdkeeper Toby. So today I'm going to talk about the biology of Cubone's skull, or more specifically, what kind of Pokemon skull I believe it to be. Now, typically the first Pokemon brought up in this discussion is Marowak. However, I'm going to explain why Marowak's skull is clearly very different from the one Cubone is wearing. Firstly, Marowak's skull is not a detachable helmet-style skull like Cubone's. The lower and upper jaws are actually fused together. You can see that in this image just from the colour. However, in Dynamax Marowak, you can see far more clearly that the two are fused with no kind of seam to indicate that there is segmentation in the animal's head. So as you can see from a variety of angles, it's very clear that Marowak's head is basically just one solid object. Kind of like a human skull or any animal skull, I'm thinking mostly mammals, where the lower and upper jaws are fused together and covered by a layer of skin. And by fused together, I just mean they are connected via a joint, rather than being completely separate. In this image, we can even see inside Marowak's mouth. And inside its mouth, we can see that it goes directly to the tongue, to the oral cavity. There's no segmentation or layers of skull. There is just one layer of head, one layer of skull involved. Similarly, Marowak's eyes tell us the same story. As you can see, Marowak's eye is sitting directly into its eye socket, into the skull, as if it were, any mammal skull, right? Just like your eyes. Marowak's eyeball is sitting directly into the eye socket, and that's just the level it's at. There's no visible evidence that there is another layer of skull beyond the eye. If you look at the rhino skull, it's the exact same, and even on Cubone. But if you look at the skull on Cubone's head, there's an obvious 3D ridge that isn't present on Marowak. What this tells us is that if the helmet-like skull that Cubone wears is a part of Marowak's biology, it is now fused and become one with Cubone's internal skull, and they are indistinguishable from one another. There is just one layer of skull, not two. You can sort of think of it like wearing a bike helmet. On the left would be Cubone, right? It's got its own skull and then the external skull, in this case the bike helmet, on top of it. Whereas the right would be Marowak. If the skull that Cubone is wearing has become a part of Marowak, it is now merged with the skull and the brain is touching, in this case, the bike helmet. The bike helmet is now the skull. And this example is if you were wearing a mask, and it's to show you the idea of the eye sockets. If you were just adding a layer of bone to the skull, you would have this large overhanging ridge on the eye socket. Whereas with just one skull, the eye sits neatly as it does with Marowak. So what I've said so far means that Marowak's skull is not detachable, right? It's one layer of internal skull. So what that means is its head shape is likely going to be the same as the shape of its skull. So we can now look at the morphology of Marowak and Cubone's skulls to see if they are the same. So, Cubone's external skull. The spines are very thin and very rounded at the end. The eye sockets are a kind of diamond tear shape, much wider and rounder. It has this little tooth thing just before the nostril. The end of its snout is sharp and curved. The nostrils are very large and they are to the sides of the snout. And the snout itself is very short and thick. On the other hand, we have Marowak's skull. The spines are much thicker, wider and sharper. The eye sockets are very narrow and thin, like arrow slits. The tooth is absent. The end of the snout is rounded and flat. The nostrils are far smaller, although, as you can imagine, on the actual skull they're probably bigger. This is again skin, Like your nose hole is much larger than the nostrils you have on your actual nose. But the key difference here is that they are at the front rather than being on the sides. And the snout is overall just much longer and thinner. Plus, Marowak has this ridge down the front and sides of the snout. So as you can see, the morphology of Marowak and Cubone's skulls are very, very different. The skull that Cubone is wearing is not a Marowak. But if it's not a Marowak, what could it be? Well, the most common Pokemon brought up in the discussion are Charizard and Kangashkan. But just looking at these, it's very obvious that it's neither of these two Pokemon. While Charizard's skull is vaguely the right shape, the spines on its head are far too long, the eyes are the wrong shape, the nostrils are at the front, and it's covered in little bumps and ridges that might be part of the skull as well. And Kangashkan, I mean, I don't know who thinks it's a Kangashkan skull. That is completely absurd. They are nothing alike. So who do I think it is? Well, I have a much simpler and probably realistic answer. Cubone is wearing a Cubone skull. This artwork of Cubone sort of lifting up its skull shows you that its head shape is pretty much that of the skull. The nostrils and the teeth are in the right location, and the eyes are vaguely the right shape as well. However, that is fake. That is not real official artwork, it's fan art. And the only artwork we have of Cubone that's official is very old, very limited release, and is clearly meant to be a very young Cubone. It's the wrong colour, it is discoloured, its limbs and snout are far stubbier and shorter than normal. If this is a Cubone, it's a very, very baby Cubone. However, my point still stands. What skull would fit best inside of another skull than the same skull, but smaller, right? Especially stuff like those spines would just fit perfectly because it's the same general shape. And it's not exactly hard for there to be different sized Cubones, right? You can imagine that as a Pokemon grows older, it's also going to grow in size, even if it's not leveling up. And it's almost very likely there are Cubones that never make it to Marowak level by the time they age and die. If that's the case, they're basically just going to be big Cubones. And either way, a newly hatched Cubone is going to be a baby. It's going to be as small as Cubone can get, meaning its skull could easily fit inside that of another Cubone skull. In my opinion, and based on the evidence I've looked at, there are no other Pokemon skulls that resemble Cubone's skull as much as Cubone's skull. As confusing as that is. But whose skull do you think it is? If you have any ideas or comments, leave them down below. I would love to hear if you have any suggestions at where you think this skull comes from. So the deck says lots of things, and I don't necessarily believe everything the deck says, but if it is the mother's skull, the mother could easily be a Cubone, right? Cubones can breed and make more Cubones. But ultimately, I believe the dex is far more up to interpretation than some other people, and is in some cases genuinely just wrong. But even just the skull itself bears many more mysteries. Where do they come from? How do they get it? Do they grow along with Cubone? Where does it go when it evolves? If you enjoyed, let me know. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe. Very close to that 1,000 mark. We should be hitting 900 soon. This was very impromptu. I made this in a day. Please don't hate me. Goodbye.